Now, to continue with the excitement, we have a great keynote session for you in store. Before we begin, I would just like to remind you all that you can submit questions throughout the session in the Q&A section on the right of your screen, and we will try to get to some of them after the talk. Our keynote speaker is one of the best thought leaders in the business when it comes to discussing the future of our streets and transportation systems and helping us identify innovative solutions, tools, and resources on how cities and counties can best focus their limited time and funding to making the greatest impact towards safe, sustainable, and smart cities that work for all. I love that term, thought leader. Yep, Mr. Rainwater has done a lot of thinking about this subject, but more importantly, he has done more work in this space. Brooks Rainwater is the Senior Executive and Director of the National League of Cities, Center for City Solutions. Rainwater drives the organization's research agenda, community engagement efforts, and leadership education program to help city leaders create strong local economies, safe and vibrant neighborhoods, world-class infrastructure, and a sustainable environment. Under his leadership of the center, he has grown and developed a host of new programs from entrepreneurial and equitable development to alternative energy and resilience to urban innovation and enhanced city governance strategies. Rainwater's research and interests include advancements in technology and city innovation, mobility, and the digital economy, and how the rise of state preemption is impacting local authority. Prior to joining the National League of Cities, Rainwater was Director of Public Policy for the American Institute of Architects, where he spearheaded the cities as a lab initiative focused on the key roles cities play as creative instigators of innovative practices. Please join me with a big virtual smile to welcome Brooks Rainwater. Welcome, Brooks.
Great. Thanks so much, Clinton, for the warm introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to join you here today. I'm usually Washington, D.C. based, but I'm actually spending a few months in Central Florida, where I grew up, in a small town called Indiaatlantic. So it's great to be able to join you at the Safe Streets Summit and share what we have been observing nationwide and all across the globe on mobility innovation, creating spaces for people, not cars, building stronger regions, and investing in transit. Let's go to the next slide. There's been a broad movement for cities to prioritize non-car transportation. We've seen major arterial streets transformed into car-free streets, the rapid rise of micromobility in small and large cities alike, increased calls for walkability, and improved transportation options and connectivity coming to the fore. This movement is something we saw pre-pandemic with major cities like San Francisco and New York closing key arterial streets. We saw Market Street becoming car-free to increase safety and improvement. We saw in New York that pedestrianized much of 14th Street, and now there are conversations around doing something very similar in Union Square plan. And this broader movement is not exclusive only to large cities, nor was this movement exclusive to pre-pandemic times. Quite the opposite. Many cities have pursued policies that encourage non-car transportation over this last year. According to data collected by researchers from UNC Chapel Hill, there have been 351 policies passed in cities across the US of temporary or permanent measures to support walking and cycling during lockdowns, such as closing streets to motor vehicles, improving infrastructure for non-motorized traffic, and dedicating public space to outdoor dining and retail. According to this database, 71 cities have dedicated public space to outdoor dining and closed streets to cars during this time, and 56 cities have exclusively closed some streets to cars. Cities have pursued these, along with a slew of other strategies, to support prioritization of public space. And I'll reiterate, public space needs to be for people, not cars, moving this away from cars for pedestrians and non-car forms of transportation. One question, though, that often comes up: how will transportation thrive during and after the pandemic amidst municipal budget cuts and a lack of direct federal funding? Next slide. I make the case that transportation will continue to thrive, but I would like to address the elephant in the room. It's great talking about this perfect future where walkability and public transportation begin to chip away at an almost centuries-long domination of cars. But what about the pandemic and budget cuts? We've been seeing a lot of budget cuts that cities have had to make. And the APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, is calling on Congress to provide at least $32 billion in emergency funding as U.S. transit agencies struggle to stay afloat. Previous recessions, though, may hold lessons for policymakers grappling to understand how transit fits into the current economic downturn. We see from the APTA data on the slide that outlines total public transportation ridership by year. From 90 to 2018, that while there have been dips in ridership over this 3-decade period, overall the trend ticks upwards, and we expect this to continue as we come out of COVID-19 pandemic. With the Biden administration in power, the current $1.9 trillion pandemic relief package proposes $20 billion in relief for transit agencies. These are much needed dollars to get our transit agencies back where they need to be, citing that public transportation systems are critical for a robust and equitable economic recovery. Next slide, please. So there's 3 elements I really want to dig into today that are critical for going forward. The first is regionalism. And we'll look at Denver, because Denver's regional transportation district is a prime example of how regionalism is the crux of good urbanism and creates positive outcomes on transportation. The RTD is the regional agency operating public transit services in 8 out of 12 counties in the Denver-Aurora-Boulder combined statistical area, which serves over 3 million people. The RTD started off with a 0.5% sales tax initiative to finance a $1.5 billion multimodal transit system. And just 3 years later, ridership grew to 35 million rides annually. Since then, RTD has expanded to offer both rail services and now expansion of the RTD through the Fast Tracks program, which will include 12 miles of new commuter rail and light rail, 18 miles of BRT, and 21,000 new parking spaces at rail and bus stations to increase connectivity across the 8-county district. The RTD has been critical to improving equitable transportation access, workforce, and economic development. And it all speaks to regionally coming together, creating priorities, and investing in the future. Let's go to the next slide. Talk more about the investment side. What we saw in Austin just this past election really kind of plays out why we need to make sure we invest in transit. Without funding, expansion of transportation options, whether done regionally or not, does not work. And that's why I'd like to point to the recent local and state ballot initiative results from November 3rd to show us that there's a broad appetite for increased investment in transportation and mobility infrastructure, even amidst the pandemic. People are still envisioning what the future looks like and investing to pay for it. So in Austin, they approved 2 transit-related measures, Proposition A and B. And one, they decided to raise taxes to help pay for a $7.1 billion Project Connect transit plan, which includes 2 new light rail lanes and expansion of the city's commuter rail. Secondly, in Proposition B, it allows the city to borrow an added $500 million for a host of infrastructure improvements, including funding set aside to fight housing displacement, because they're very much concerned about gentrification that can come about by new transit investment. And we've seen similar results in the Bay Area, which also approved additional funding for their regional transit system. Once again, showing that mix between regionalism and investment that really drives us forward. On the next slide. There also needs to be cultural shifts because we've talked about funding, we've talked about regionalism, but aside from the practicalities of bolstering transit systems, how do we begin to dismantle the pervasiveness of car culture, particularly as many people who have the financial means to turn to private forms of transportation over public transportation amidst public health concerns? In Los Angeles, for example, motor vehicle crashes are the 4th leading cause of premature death in the county. And the city of LA recently put $400 billion behind a 30-year transportation blueprint with the ultimate aim to ease traffic delays, reduce air pollution, institute complete streets, and provide access to opportunity. They're going to invest in new mobility options such as on-demand microtransit, while allocating additional money for repairs and additional money to local transit agencies. These types of investments, being focused holistically, are really how you can move these types of programs ahead. And while LA has historically been in many ways the antithesis to walkability and good transportation, long-term investment is necessary to begin to turn the tide in a positive direction. Next slide. And finally, to round us out, I would be remiss not to mention some great movements coming out of European city counterparts, specifically Barcelona and Paris. Barcelona has received significant attention over the Superblock, which is an excellent idea in which blocks, which are about 400 meters by 400 meters, keep car traffic on the outskirts of each area, allowing the interior block to prioritize more space for walking, cycling, and increased social cohesion. And it's starting to transform different parts of Barcelona where they started in the center and are moving it further and further out. And it's just exciting to see because it creates the space for people to move without cars getting in their way. And similarly, we've heard a lot about the 15-minute city, and this started in Paris early last year, where they've received significant attention over their championing of it. And it's a simple idea in many ways, with the potential for massive improvements in urban transportation. The idea is that everyone living in a city should have access to essential urban services within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. And I think that's key because, having that 15-minute walk shed or 15-minute bike shed gives people the opportunity to access all of those things they need. And while it's always important to remember context, there is no need to reinvent the wheel every time. Cities like Barcelona and Paris provide good models by which to construct vision plans going forward. And cities all around the world are now instituting 15-minute cities, with Seattle one of the latest to say that it is exploring the concept as part of their plan to build back better with its COVID-19 recovery plan. Next slide. Lastly, I would like to discuss the opportunities that we now have ahead of us with federal, state, and local partnership under the Biden administration. At least 6 of President Biden's cabinet nominees or confirmed secretaries served as mayors or governors, including Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, and the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And he is just a great champion for many of these issues that we talk about on transit and transportation. And this is a sharp contrast to what we saw during the Trump administration, wherein a lot of the cabinet members mostly consisted of corporate and industry leaders. And most recently, Biden's economic stimulus package proposed to provide $350 billion in aid to city governments, which is more than double the $160 billion that a number of Congress members backed late last year in a bipartisan compromise proposal. I think one of the things a friend of mine, Eddie Tomer, who leads the Metropolitan Infrastructure Initiative at Brookings, says that he expects the Biden administration may foster an array of pro-metropolitan policies, which dovetails nicely with the cabinet nominees that have mayoral and gubernatorial experience, who would like to have a strong network of local officials they can draw on. And you can imagine, coming from the National League of Cities, this makes us incredibly happy because so much of what drives America are cities and regions. And so very excited to see what can come in the future here. We can go to the next slide. Because ultimately, this all comes down to solid long-range regional planning. We need to focus on people, not cars. We need to elevate and institute robust transit systems and create livable, dynamic places. Thank you all very much. Now, Clinton, I'll pass it over to you.
Brooks, wow. Chock full of great information. Thank you for that talk. I'm sure many in the audience they've really enjoyed that talk. I'm excited to enter into a discussion and question and answer related to this keynote session. 5 years ago, Brooks, I joined PalmTran, and it was it's just so delighting to know that many of the things that you said connected with what we did about 5 years ago in a full day with about half of our staff. And that was revising our mission statement, trying to really nail down our why. And so our mission statement, and you actually referred to it a few times, and I think that's what transportation services is all about. Our mission statement doesn't have the word transit or transportation in it. It is to provide access to opportunity for everyone, safely, efficiently, and courteously. The access, that's what it's about. Employment, to seek employment, to, access our parks, access our beautiful beaches here, to fulfill important medical appointments, or to just go visit grandma. It's about access to opportunity for everyone. And so thank you for talking and hitting on that access subject. Let me kick it off with the first question. Again, I'll remind our viewers that you could submit your questions, and we'll try to field some and have a great discussion. Brooks, what recommendations do you have for cities to pursue a non-car transportation agenda equitably?
Sure, I think this is such a critical question. And particularly as cities have gone through a series of reopenings, partial closures, and reopenings again, what we're seeing is that people are wary of riding public transit or using shared mobility services, unfortunately, because so much of the data says there's no reason whatsoever for them to be wary of it. But as a result, it raises the transportation justice issue that BIPOC rely more heavily on public transportation are more likely to be employed in essential services, meaning that they are more exposed to public health risks, not only on the job, but transporting themselves to and from their places of work. So that's why I think that community engagement needs to be integral. One of the examples I've seen that has worked really well is in the city of Oakland with their Transform program. It's a local nonprofit that they've worked together with on various mobility projects. And with the help of Transform, low-income bike share ridership grew from just 3% to 20% of bike share membership as of June 2018. And Transform played the critical role of bridging the gap between low-income community members and a lack of transit access. And so I really do think that across the board, you need to have increased communication. Cities need to outline clear goals for providers and provide the regulatory environment that allows for companies to flourish in the cities they want. And everyone needs to set clear goals and benchmarks when you do public-private partnerships. Because additionally, with a clear understanding from parties of what needs are desired to be accomplished, cities are able to track success more easily and make sure that we're focusing in on equitable development, on equitable access, because at the end of the day, that's what we need. That's what we have our mobility systems for, to make sure that everyone can get around and make sure that they have the opportunities that they need.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Here, I have a few questions that have popped in. Let's see here. It's pretty active. Wow, you're getting a lot of questions. So if you had to guess, what portion of Biden administration transit funding will go towards sustaining existing transit services, and what portion will go to new capital projects?
So I think this is probably the distinction of the early on, because there's such a backlog of existing programs that need funding, that I would see a bigger portion at the current moment going to that. I mean, a lot of transit agencies are just hurting. The ridership levels are down so much that we really need that backstop. But from everything I've heard and the people around the Biden administration, there's a vision for the future. So they are thinking about, how do we expand transit? How do we expand mobility options in cities? So again, kind of hearkening back on the fact that they have all these mayors and governors involved, at not just the cabinet level, but also kind of the sub level beneath them. There's a lot of people from local government that have a seat at the table. I think we're going to see a lot of transformative change within the mobility and transit industry. And I'm very excited about it.
Thank you. Let me throw in another question of mine. Mm-hmm. Can you speak more to the importance of regionalism and funding to successfully drive transportation initiatives?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is just such a critical thing. There's just no getting around it. Particularly as we're trying to get away from decades of auto-dominated policies that must be reversed, thinking about smart growth and transit together, and also the burgeoning equity movement has put a renewed light on the importance of regionalism and regional institutions. So funding and thinking regionally, I mean, this isn't just transportation. I mean, bringing together local leaders on a whole host of different issues, whether it's transportation, whether it's sustainability, whether it's health now with everything with the public health crisis. By creating these linkages between regional leaders, it makes it a lot easier. Economic development is always the first thing that you have regional competition on. And when you're able to kind of break down those barriers and recognize that you're all in it together, that the South Florida region is going to sink or swim, collectively, rather than, Miami's going to do great while Palm Beach doesn't do good. that fundamentally, by being a regional powerhouse, you're going to be able to compete both within the United States, but also globally. So many of our great regions, like South Florida, are competing on a global level. And so having the transportation infrastructure to develop the community that much better is going to let you compete in ways that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Well, great. Great response. We really appreciate that. Here, let me throw a few additional questions out at you that are coming in pretty steadily. What are cities doing, to your knowledge, now to deal with the budget problems before federal funds may become available?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the unfortunate things that many cities have had to do is furlough and lay off some staff because they have to balance budgets first and foremost. It's just, I mean, it's the law. They don't have a choice. And so where they have been able to, they've either cut programming or had to do something at the staff level. I mean, we're hopeful, though, that there's been a lot of talk about direct aid to cities and counties. And as the stimulus package is currently moving forward, I do believe that we're going to get that, and it's going to help make those communities whole because this is the last time that you want to see municipal employees losing their job. I mean, these are frontline workers that are helping all of us every day. And so really hopeful that we have that support that's needed. And frankly, it's also been helpful in many states where the state level budgets have not been hit as hard as they first thought they would be. Particularly in those states that are doing a good job of sharing revenue with localities. You mentioned in my intro, one of the things I work on is state level preemption. There are some challenges in many states, particularly where you have political distinctions between local governments and state governments, where sometimes the revenue sharing isn't what it could be. But in those places where it can, that's also a level of support that's helpful.
All right. Any comments on the implementation of mobility plans as a vehicle to move people, not cars, funding, and ways to integrate safe street topics into a mobility plan?
So I think on that one, when I think of overall ways that we're going to help people get around, it is leaning on micromobility and alternate transportation plans in many different ways. And I've seen a number of cities that are starting to integrate those plans more so within their overall mobility plan rather than seeing them kind of separately, which we saw, a few years back when scooters and other things started to pop up on our sidewalks and create opportunities and challenges. I would expect to continue to see this only grow. Particularly as we've moved from the pilot stage to where they're full-scale implementation plans. I'm excited. I've done a lot of work within the micromobility space in particular. And I do think that scooters and bikes create an integral piece within transit that the more that we can connect them and fix those first mile, last mile challenges we have in many cities, the better. So I think this is going to be only an area of growth.
Well, we're definitely going to have to bring you back, because you're speaking my language, and if I can just kind of reflect on that comment, this pandemic situation that we're in has made us resilient, but it also has made us more nimble and innovative. And one of the things that we're looking at here in Palm Beach County, after a successful redesign of the bus network in 2018, which we affectionately call the Route Performance Maximization Project, we're looking at RPM 2.0, and that is, partnering with the Ubers, the Lyfts, the taxis, the scooters of the world to fulfill that gap in our current system in a hugely large county, where the first and last mile is a very serious gap, and we need to fulfill to build our ridership. In addition to looking at a model that we implemented in a very rural part of the county, which started out as a flex system, but went on to be a full on-demand service similar to Uber and Lyft, and it is the only service during the pandemic that has not lost ridership. And so we are part of that paradigm shift that you referred to here at Palm Tran and the industry in general. This is a disruption, but we're finding ways to maximize this current situation that we're in with the pandemic. So that's great. Let's see here. What else do we have coming in here? Wow, it's just so many questions, and which one do I pick? So you have sparked some tremendous engagement here by our virtual audience. How can transportation services planning and implementation better and more actively mitigate lived experience, emergency resilience, and community needs and support of transit and mobility models, design elements, and frameworks? Now, if you need me to repeat that, I will, but this is how sophisticated our viewers are. Pretty good.
So I think transportation services planning and implementation can really look at these things holistically and figure out how it is that you kind of build the models that work for a community itself, but also scale to the regional level. And really think about, what is the proper mix for a place? What are the density levels that you have? What types of corridors are you trying to build out? And using transit as a development tool as well as a mobility tool to help people get around. So ultimately, I think that kind of figuring out that mix for your place, finding the investment in order to do it. And then, as you were just saying, Clinton, figuring out how you work together with the private sector partners, because we don't want to see, Uber and Lyft competing directly against transit, but we do want to see them in a connected way, both through the scooter companies that they own, as well as the vehicles that they drive, help fix some of those gaps that we have everywhere. There's no region that doesn't have the gaps that, in a perfect world, we would have more and more dollars to invest and fix the gaps ourselves on the public sector side. But kind of barring an infusion of capital that's much higher than anything I've heard, figuring out how we work with those private sector partners to kind of create that overall plan is really the way we need to move forward.
All right, here's a top vote getter question. So there were many attempts to pedestrianize streets that failed miserably, and only a few exciting successes. And they picked, and I think in Miami Beach, Lincoln Road, and of course, Times Square. Please share what unique elements did the few successes have to actually do to be successful?
Sure, this is actually a great question. And I've done some research specifically in this space. And we put out a report probably like a year and a half ago on pedestrian zones, where we looked at the successes as well as the failures. So I think a lot of what we saw in the successes, and those were earlier on, particularly in European cities, were the cultural shift, where people weren't wholly dependent on cars. And so by pedestrianizing streets, what they were doing is largely bringing back a mode of transportation they were very familiar with in many older European cities, which is just to walk around or bike around. And so it was an easier shift. In many places in the US where they tried some early pedestrian zones back in the 70s and 80s, the failure was that we just weren't at a moment in time where we were comfortable getting out of our cars and utilizing other ways to get around in the way that we have now kind of shifted into that mode in the last dozen years or so. And so not only was it that we weren't comfortable with it, but we didn't have the transit infrastructure. We didn't have the micromobility tools that we now have. So all of these other pieces that have now come into play are making pedestrian zones look very different. Obviously, they've been supercharged during the pandemic because people needed new ways to get around. But I do think that fundamentally what has shifted is the way that we now approach in most major cities, vehicular kind of traffic coming in and out of cities, as well as how people themselves access and engage with the city itself. And so, I pointed to what we saw there in New York as well as San Francisco, But I do think that, during the pandemic where Seattle closed like 30 miles of streets, all of them won't stay closed long term, but they're learning, they're collecting data as they go to see which ones are working. How is this changing the dynamics of how people are utilizing the city? Are we seeing more and more bike ridership? These are all kind of data points we're going to be able to see writ large from many of these street closures now. But I'm pretty excited to think about on the other side what we do and how we create dynamic environments where commerce can thrive too, because that was where we saw in some of the earlier failures that we closed streets, didn't have all the other connection pieces, and stores and restaurants did not thrive in those spaces, where now we see the exact opposite, where we have pedestrian zones and the restaurants and commercial entities that are there are actually doing really, really well.
So this prioritizing pedestrians, what implications directly does this shift have from a long-term land use perspective?
Yeah, so I think it has some real key implications because you can start to think about development in different ways. If all of a sudden you're pedestrianizing some key corridors downtown, I think the core piece is what it does is it starts to open up more outside space for commerce. So restaurants are probably the clearest examples where right now there are many parts of cities where restaurants would love to put 20 or 30 tables outside and basically expand their business. They're paying high rents. They might not get as many people that they could, it's such a low margin business that all of a sudden, if you give them a lot more space to have people kind of enjoy that, they're able to make more money. More people are able to go to that restaurant. It drives more people into that part of the city that then go into the stores and other things all around it. And then you've created a more vibrant space overall. And so I think that the key thing from a land use perspective is probably not building, buildings that come out further into the street so much as kind of opening up that public space for more commerce, for more placemaking devices, put more parks in. Think about pocket parks are another great thing that you can bring in. Parklets where you take over what was parking before. I think by kind of intermingling all of that, you're able to create a much more dynamic space where people want to be.
All right, well, thanks for that. Can you share more about the international examples that we can learn from, especially after COVID-19? One of the questions that we have coming in here.
Sure. I think one that's always good to talk about is Copenhagen, because people look at Copenhagen and kind of put it up on this pedestal as a place that just does everything right. Well, it didn't always do everything right. It didn't always have 30 or 40% of the population that rides bikes everywhere. It hadn't always had the pedestrian spaces that it does and kind of the development that it did. If you go back 40, 50 years, Copenhagen looked much like a lot of American cities that was heavily auto dependent. Yeah, it still had a public transportation network that would be an envy of many American cities, but that's pretty common across European places. But it didn't have all these other things. What it did have, though, was local leaders in the government as well as business community that were willing to work with the federal government there to transform the place into something better. It had a long-term vision of what it wanted to be. And they came together, co-developed what that vision would look like. And, fast forward now 4 or 5 decades later, and what you see is what many places around the world are now trying to become. Which is to get people out of cars, think about different ways they can get around. Because part of the problem with cities and cars isn't just the environmental side, which is pretty critical, but it's congestion. I mean, frankly, the thing about a dynamic region with millions of people that live there, everybody trying to get into the centers where jobs are, you just have so much congestion that it kind of clogs up the city in many ways. It's frustrating. I mean, let's be honest, it's super frustrating to be in a car in the middle of traffic trying to get into the city to work or to do anything else. So by opening up different ways of getting around, whether it's on bikes at a scale of like a Copenhagen or, even less so in Paris, which didn't actually have a lot of bicycle riders, 15 years ago until they brought in their bike share program. These kind of transformations can take place rather quick when there's concerted effort by leaders within that region and the funding to back it up.
All right. Here's one. Vehicles will soon react autonomously to design potentially increasing sprawl and threaten those who are forced to ignore those same designs due to a lack of human scale infrastructure like ADA, bikers, micro transit, pedestrians. How can we plan to mitigate this?
So I think what I've been trying to figure out about autonomous vehicles, as well as kind of the engagement between autonomous vehicles and pedestrians and other things, is will we really see autonomous vehicles at scale anytime soon? I can reflect on my own work, and I did a lot of work around autonomous vehicles and how they would integrate with cities back in like 2015, 2016. I wrote some really cool articles for TechCrunch and other places talking about like how excited we needed to be for 2020 and the early 2020s when they were going everywhere. And it just hasn't come to pass. The technology is still not there at the level that's going to help it scale. I do think we will see autonomous vehicles at some point, but it's looking more like to where it starts to transform cities, probably more like the 2030s, maybe even up to 2040. And so from a long range perspective, because we build out long range plans of 10, 15, 20 years, we need to make sure that they are indeed included as a part of the conversation. But I think that putting them forward as a panacea that's going to fix problems or even cause more problems is probably not the space that we need to be in at the moment. I think, honestly, transit investments, thinking about what we can do with micromobility to scale that larger, investing in electric bikes. I mean, frankly, if we were able to give people tax credits to go out and buy electric bikes, that would help transform a lot of things. We did that with electric cars. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's still out there that can help us on this regard. Let's make sure we think about autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks, and like what could be long-term. But let's first and foremost focus on what we can change now and in the near term, because there's a lot to do. And I think that's an important point. There's a lot to do right now with what we know we can change at the moment.
Brooks, champions. Who have you seen in your work as the champions for revolutionizing how we think about mobility and pushing those projects forward and eventually across the line, especially in a car-centric community? Who are the folks that leads these initiatives successfully?
So I think it's usually a mixture of folks. I mean, I'm biased because I work with mayors and council members every day, and I do find that there are a lot of mayors and council members that are champions for these issues. But it's a mixture of them and the bully pulpit that local elected officials have, coming together with folks in the business community, coming together with nonprofit leaders, and then civic participation. I mean, none of these things work well if you don't have the community on board, if you don't have the community engaged and understanding what it is that you're all collectively moving towards. Because the champion needs to be the people, because ultimately that's how elected officials are there. They're there working on behalf of the community members. And so if you have a vision that people aren't bought into, you're not going to see transformation. And ultimately, that's where all of the community leaders coming together and clearly stating what that vision is and talking about how it is that you can get there, are you going to get that buy-in? And you can see exciting things happen as a result. But it's also good, as I said, to make sure that public and private are kind of steering in the same way, because all of these investments aren't going to be made purely by the public sector.
All right, Brooks, I tell you, your answers, I mean, I'm thinking, what can't you answer? Your answers are crystal clear. However, the audio is not as crystal clear. So if you can just maybe adjust your speaker just slightly, you probably get a little more. But I really appreciate the responses, and I think you're really spot on with a lot of these issues. And I know just by listening to you, it's extremely helpful, and I hope it is as fruitful and helpful to our virtual audience. Let's see, what else do we have here? any comments on the implementation of mobility plans as a vehicle to move people, not cars, funding, and ways to integrate safe street topics into a mobile? I think we talked about that, right? We talked about that question. All right. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come in.
So maybe I'll turn it around and ask you a question, Clinton. What are you most excited about happening there in the region?
Well, 9 months ago, we were really, I think, on a trajectory of really talking about this conversation about, how we fund a more aggressive public transit system. And of course, our friend, the pandemic, hit us. And so we really have been in a mode of almost really survival, right? This pandemic has changed the industry. It has been a major disruption. And our fight right now is to get our riders back, our customers back. And the advice early on was correct, right? The advice was spot on, is that, this disease is communicable through, people that in close gatherings. And so, transit is a place where you gather. It is a shared ride. So it was advisable not to use transit. But what has happened, I think, Brooks, is people have found other means of meeting their mobility needs, during this pandemic that may be a little more direct than transit, that may be a little more frequent than transit. So we have to look at those things. And we have to, say, okay, we need to do a little bit of that. And that's what we're going to do with RPM 2.0. But I believe it will come back as, more shots are in the arm. And, we talk about the herd, once more than 75% of people get vaccinated, we believe that people will be more comfortable with getting back on transit. What we're doing now is building the confidence in the public to say, hey, our buses are clean. We have a robust cleaning process. We have our bus operators wear masks. Everyone who rides now have to wear masks. We have hand sanitizers that are equipped on the buses. And so we want to communicate to the public that it is a safe place to gather again, eventually. We're not there yet. So our paradigm shift has been, we used to think a lot about our metrics of riders and bringing more customers into the system. And it shifted all to safety, where we have to ensure the safety of both our bus operators and our customers. And so that's what our focus has been on now. But in the interim, we also are looking at how, when they come back, how can we make sure they stay back? And we provide more access via transit and alternative transportation other than the car. So that's what we're thinking about right now here in Palm Beach.
That's great. That actually sounds like a very similar thing that people all around the country are focused on right now. Because like you said, I mean, the mobility numbers have gone down so much as people haven't been using transit. But I do wonder, as communities open back up and as more people are going back into cities to work, that you'll start to see that transit ridership go up again. But I do think that the distinction that a lot of us are thinking about is, how often will people be going back to work? Will it go back to the 5-day work week, or instead of we're going to be like 1 or 2 days a week, and then people are working remotely the rest of the time? Because that has some serious implications on transit too. Some positive though, because you might start to think about how can transit look a little bit different. So it's not just the hub and spoke pattern that we see in many communities, but helping people get around, within the smaller communities that surround major cities as well. So while there are challenges right now, and I think speaks to why cities and transit agencies need those federal dollars so much, long term, I'm hopeful that we see some changes that could be net positive for overall regions.
Yeah, I'm one to feel that, crisis breeds innovation. And you have a lot of silver linings throughout this crisis. One of the things, to your point, in the workspace, we want to create as much social distancing as possible, but we're critical infrastructure, so we still have to operate our service. And so our call center, which is about 75 folks in a big building, right? Very close together in cubicles, answering the phones, customer service, reservations, dispatch. So we had to send all of those folks home and equip them to work from home. Well, I can't see that changing, because what has happened is that our metrics in those areas, in terms of the calls in queue and the quick response to answer questions from the customer, the superior customer service that our customers are experiencing, all because our reservationists and customer service agents are answering their phones in their PJs, and they're home and they're comfortable. And so I can't see how that changes, because everyone gets to work on time, and our call answer has decreased. The call wait has decreased substantially. And so those are things that I think this pandemic has brought to make us more efficient, that probably won't change. But I also think about what you just said. That's not only our case. That's other businesses' cases who have realized that all of these employees don't have to drive downtown or take transit downtown every day. And so they found these efficiencies. So how that will impact public transit is something that we also are looking very closely at.
Well, I think you mentioned one of those areas that'll be helpful with that too, is looking at things like microtransit and having more focused, non-specific routes to kind of react to that. Because if you have more people that are in those, bedroom communities within your county, how do you help them get around during the day? How do you have them access the retail and restaurants and other things that are going to help all parts of the community thrive? And that's where transit, having the flexibility that it can have, and ultimately working with some of those micromobility operators and others, can create new systems that'll create the dynamic space that we need.
Well, this has been absolutely, for me, a joy. I hope our listening and viewing audience have also really enjoyed this, and we hope you have some great takeaways to take back to your communities, and we can hear about them next year at next year's summit, hopefully in person. But Brooks, we would really like to thank you for your talk and your insights today. I've learned a lot. So thank you. So if we all can give Brooks Rainwater a big virtual smile and show appreciation for a great talk today. So thanks again, Brooks, for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to remind everyone to please complete the evaluation for this session by going to the link in the session description or going to the conference evaluation section at the top of your event lobby. Thank you for participating today. Have a great day.